So today we'll be talking about leveraging data and analytics for smarter talent decisions. Today I am joined by Dominic Peters, who is the Director of People Operations at Axiom Telecom, Caroline Gladwin, who is Executive Solution Director for HCM and Analytics at Oracle, with whom we are co-hosting this webinar, and Anindio Naskar, who is the Head of Learning and Development at Landmark Group. So with so many employees that are currently reevaluating their personal, their professional lives with everything that's happened over the past 18 months, and of course, changing jobs based on your priorities, HR leaders and staff need to really have a bird's eye view on the mood and the culture of their workforce so that they can take relevant and swift action where needed. However, we all know that data is a big topic. Do we get the right data? What data do we need? How do we make it tell the stories? Adopting an evidence-based approach and leaning on data and analytics can really help people professionals make more strategic decisions, but it can also be very confusing. Are we using it in the right way? And what can we learn from our panelists today? These are some of the questions that we will tackle. Before we get started, please note that this webinar is recorded. You'll be able to check it out on YouTube once the session is over. And during the webinar, we'd love for you to share your thoughts, your comments. Let us know if you agree or disagree with our panel today, but also share your questions and thoughts. I will pick them up as they come if they are relevant to the topic that we're discussing at the time when you're posting your question, or we will pick up the last questions towards the end of the session. This webinar is a 1-hour session, and I see we have a lot of people who have attended previous sessions, so welcome back, everybody. Thank you for always joining us. All right, so to get us started, perhaps it would be helpful to start by defining data and analytics. What do we mean by that? And what do we need in order to do our jobs correctly? I'll first go to you, Dominic, perhaps, to kick us off.
Hi, Charlotte. So what I want to do is start off with this is there's a bit of I suppose, a myth around data. There's always been data around us. There's always been data around the systems. What we haven't done very well in the past is used it correctly or used it at all. So it's about gathering and analyzing data about people in a workforce. So it can be used to measure a workforce for internal and external stakeholders, performance, well-being. Big topics now are inclusion and diversity. And it enables more effective evidence-based decisions on improving workforce and organizational performance. And the thing is we talk all the time about this seat at the table. And finance, if they're going to go and do something, it's all hard fact. And I think the other issue is a lot of the stuff we've done on data is historical. So we tell the business, oh, this many people left last year. And I think what people are looking more from us now are insights. So we have all this information. What can you potentially tell us could happen in the future?
Yes, quite a few things that we'll get to touch on in today's session. Caroline, would you like to comment on that? Please feel free to.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things with this whole area is to, when you're considering this as an organization, is to be really honest and think about where are you in terms of delivering this. So, you know, as Dom says, most people have almost got too much data, and often the question becomes, is it trustworthy? Am I going to have credibility if I present this to the business? And what am I expecting the business to do with that data? So for me, one of the starting points of this whole conversation is around where are you as an organization? So are you in the sort of area of you're doing the so-called kind of descriptive and diagnostic type of analytics where you're able to look at what's happened and you maybe have a little bit of an idea why? Or are you actually at the stage where you're confident of your data and you can start to move more into that predictive and maybe even the kind of prescriptive of, you know, what should you do next? And I think if you can start from an honest view of where you are with your data, with your skills, and also with where your organization is in terms of data literacy and understanding what the data is telling them and what they should do with it, I think that gets you into a really strong place in terms of them beginning to move things forward.
Yes, thank you. Andy, where do you think we are as organizations in the region?
So, Charlotte, I think as organizations, and I would not specifically only talk about retail, because we recently looked at some of the other conversations around data. I think in the Middle East market, a lot of people are aware. Almost 30 to 40% of people are aware that they need to finally look at data to take talent decisions. And it's not only for the future, but also how has the past given way to the future. So that's one thing which, even Caroline was talking of more of, different levels of analytics. But I think with most of the organizations, and I again come back to KSA, one of the major markets, in the entire region, where people are really looking at a lot of data and how they could actually use data. And it's not their internal data alone, but also data from various sources, because if you look at your only HRS system, it's just not contained to that. It's also how do you integrate data from different sources. And the most important part, which Dom touched on, is what is the validity or the veracity of the data which you have in space, and does that allow you to take future decisions? I think that would be really, where the entire region is looking at.
Yes, lots of questions around trust, I see. Before we move forward, you've talked about we're talking about making evidence-based decisions and how data informs us across the board. Dominic, when you first talked, you talked about obviously performance, which is something we can often measure, presenteeism, absenteeism, but also you touched on things like diversity and inclusion. And today, well, over the past 18 months, organizations have had to relook at their culture, at the makeup of their workforces, but also at the well-being. How are they really looking after their people? Can data really help us or inform us on the intangibles of a workforce?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when we talk about evidence-based decision-making, the problem with, if you would say HR, or not the problem, is HR people, we deal with ambiguity all the time. And it's part of our job. And maybe that's what moves us into this profession rather than being in finance or IT. So what we tend to do is we go on hunches and feelings. Now, fact in front of us, which can show, you can break this down to departments in your area. It can show diversity, so there's different things there. It can show how people feel about things. And then we could be asking ourselves, who should we be hiring? How do we measure performance? Who should we promote? Is our training working? If we change incentives, what happens? And one of the issues that we have as people is there are so many biases that go into our judgments. And what this does is it helps remove that with plain and simple fact, because we might say all the time, I think this is going on, or I feel this is the way we should be going. Actually having those figures in front of us can really help us make those correct evidence-based decisions.
I think, Dom, just to add to that, I think the companies that I work with who do this really well is the analytics team actually feel as if they've got the ability to really challenge the business in terms of the evidence they're presenting. So part of the key thing for me is not only presenting the evidence and making that accessible and actionable and all the other things we know, but actually taking time to have those conversations to say, this data might actually be different to emotionally what you want to do and what you think you should do. And so that can be a very difficult conversation. And I think, as I say, the teams I see doing this really well are not only presenting the evidence, but they're taking the time to have the conversations and to talk through what the data means and why it means that, to try and avoid that situation where people have already made their decision and they then cherry pick the bits of the evidence that support the decision they were going to make anyway. I don't know whether you've seen that as well.
Yeah, so it's kind of like outcome bias in a way, isn't it? Sometimes is your decision at the end, and they go back and say we want to go and do this. I mean, it's silly things like the classic one all businesses do is you've got an issue, say with sales or something like that, and then they say we need more training. Well, how much is more training, and when does it make a difference? And could you take a set of, say for example in retail, a set of stores and do a certain amount of training in one area, see its relation to sales, and then do a certain amount of training in another and make the comparison. I think those are the conversations that businesses want to have with HR, not saying we did some more training and then say there was X amount of training hours. They want to know what value we created for the business. And you know, when we start piecing this together, and I think going back to both your points, the issue we have is we've got all these disparate systems absolutely everywhere with all this information on. How do we bring it all together? Because it's difficult to get it from some areas and join it up into something which adds value, where someone is going to invite you and say, listen, if we try this with our people, I mean, one of the things we go on about all the time is if people in every business, we acknowledge they are our greatest asset, then why aren't we using data to make all the decisions like we do in marketing, like we do in finance? And I think this is going to be the big win for us going forward in the future.
So, you know, Dom, just adding on the context of retail and on the context of bias, you see, with one of the biggest challenges which I've had with, you know, multiple retail learning giants across and some other people at the oil and gas, that sometimes your performance or your learning or your talent program data do not cohere with the performance on the ground. You see, so this person might be having an amazing assessment score, might be having an amazing talent program score, but at the ground level performance, that guy doesn't make the cut. And we've seen this at a variety of reasons. So I think sometimes the entire bias also, you know, comes out from performance of people on the ground. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that comes down to two things, and this is the problem with people data. There's two flaws to it. There's, first of all, there's context, and then there's interdependency. So the reality is, you know, I'm only as good as my team. So I might do an okay job here, but I might go to another organization and be absolutely terrible. But the problem we have is, in terms of performance, is how do you prize away the performance in something against all the other things as well? That's what makes it, and it's a classic example. So let's say, for example, one of your best performers, they're in a shopping mall and the shopping mall's performing really badly, so you're not getting footfall. So there's an interdependence there, and it's about trying to go back and prize that data and do those different things there. Another example of context is Google did some work a few years ago and said, listen, without doubt, GPA is not a predictor of success in our company. So we don't look at it. Goldman Sachs came back and said, well, actually, we've looked at it and GPA is very important. So again, one of the things with the data is the context of the organization, your culture, your management. There's all these other things that go into it. That's why it makes it very difficult sometimes to feed back this information to businesses.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dominic. I think ultimately evidence-based practice leads to is reliant on not just data, but it's a combination of also critical thinking, the context, and the best available evidence to really make the data speak. And that leads me to my next question. So you're all saying that data has been there, we have tons of it, if not too much of it. Problem is, what do we do with it, and how do we move from using it in a way that's just informing what we have done to getting what we'll do in the future? Is data a skills, or is this a skills or a data question, in your opinion? Do we have the right skills? Do businesses have the right skills, in particular, do people professionals have the right skills to leverage analytics in your perspective? I'd love to hear from you, Dominic, shortly, and then hear some examples from you, Caroline.
Yeah, I personally don't think we do. I don't think I do. I think it's something I'm still learning about as well. It's a completely different skill set. And I think the previous point about what's really important is the people who are going to do this work they'd probably like to think there was a purpose to doing it, so they could actually go back and influence and say, listen, this is what we see around performance, this is what we see about diversity, and then that data is actually actionable. I think the other issue as well is you probably need people who are non-emotive doing this, because it's very easy to be in an organization and read it. I mean, I'll give you an example here. When we did an engagement survey at the end of COVID, we had the highest ever engagement score. And when I went back to people, they said, no, that can't be true. And I was saying, but we had 90% of people respond, and they said it was true. But the feelings of everybody individually was COVID had been terrible, so everybody hadn't felt great. What we found was people were engaged because of how they felt around, they were treated at the time by the organization. So this was, again, a contradiction. So you need people who are specifically trained in this, and also probably have skills in able to go into all these different areas, whether it's finance, whether it's sales, whether it's the until we get one system, and to be able to piece that information together. So I think it's a new skill set for HR.
Yeah, and I know this is a topic that we explored with you, Caroline, last time around skills. What do you think are the skills that are required of people professionals in order to take this to the next level and truly leverage data?
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree with Dom in terms of from an HR perspective. I don't think many HR professionals went into HR, certainly those people who've been in it for more than 10 years, thinking that data skills would be a key requirement for their role. But increasingly, I mean, a lot of the business partners I talk to internally at Oracle, data and understanding data and making sense of it and working with the business are a absolutely fundamental part of their roles now. What I would say is, I'm working with one of the large UK retailers at the moment, and they've made a decision to fundamentally change the organization to become what they're calling data driven. And they don't see this as an overnight sort of thing that they're going to achieve, if you like. But what they've done is they've in effect segmented their population across the business and in HR and in all the teams into sort of levels of capability that they think these people need. And then everyone is now being upskilled to the level that retailer thinks their staff need to be at. And obviously, for the data scientists, the real core analytics people in HR, that's a much higher level than a line manager. But it's absolutely fundamental to not only have the data, but for everybody to have the skills to understand what that data is telling them and to be able to act accordingly, because we all probably don't have the full range of skills we need. And it's so easy with data to misread it, to not understand the difference, for example, between, correlation and causation, to kind of cherry pick the bits you like to give you the answer you want, or to not be aware of maybe the bias in the sample that you're looking at, which is then going to give you the answer you want. So I think the skills you need vary across the organization. And again, it's important to not only know where you are, but to have a plan, I think, to get everyone a certain level of data literacy to be able to move the organization forward. And the final thing I would say is, a lot of the organizations I work with who are really moving more successfully into this, there's really strong leadership from the top. So the key business leaders are demonstrating and actually really shouting about where the data has enabled them to make a decision that's then delivered a really good business outcome. So it's driven revenue, or it's reduced costs, or it's allowed the business model to pivot to a different model in the last 18 months. And I think where you have that senior leadership really demonstrating to everyone that they are using the data in a constructive way, I think that sort of culture slowly over time starts to cascade down. And when you combine that with having the right skills at the right level for the different roles you've got, you're starting to move towards a situation where you can really change the way the business runs.
Yes, thank you both. I'm putting down some resources in the chat, which I'm mindful won't be available in the recording, but evidence-based and having an evidence-based approach is core to the CIPD's profession map, which is essentially what we use is the competency framework for the people profession. And when we talk about evidence-based, it's like what Caroline, what you're saying, it's not just organizational data, but it's a mix of different areas of expertise. So you need practitioner expertise and your professional judgment, which is really, really important in applying evidence to your practice. You also need to take into account the stakeholder concerns and all of the intangibles like we've mentioned, and having those conversations to understand if it matches the data. And finally, of course, behavioral research, behavioral science and academic research that are really, really important to informing what we do and keeping a close eye on what organizations are doing in the market. I specifically feel like it's important to highlight, you've all mentioned it, that tendency that we can have to gathering data that fits our own narrative instead of looking at the data and then building a narrative. And I think that's a bias. We all have biases in our profession, but that's especially important when you don't have the skills yet. You're still playing catch up on learning how to read those figures and this data, etc. And it can lead, we've seen with quite a few organizations, it can lead to decisions that are not necessarily very inclusive or very, very just if you're looking to fit your own narrative. We've talked about trust. So we could have a whole session about this, but I do want to touch on the question of trust. How do we trust data? How do we know we've got it right? And how do we get people to trust it? Because I think that's come up a few times in what you've all said and the comments I'm reading. Dom, Caroline?
Sure. So the first one is with data, and I think Caroline would support me on this, is garbage in, garbage out. So you've got to think of well, first of all, what problem are you solving? What do you want to go and do with it? Then the validity of that data. So there's the sample size, there's the age of the data, there's the relevance, those different things there. And I think the other one as well is in terms of the interpretation, and I think it goes back to Caroline's point again, is training people to understand where it can go wrong. So we have the data, and again, Charlotte, to your point, there's context. So you have one organization which has a culture, a specific culture, a specific leadership style, a specific way of doing, however it is there. So you can't say, oh, just because Google do this, we're doing this as well. So there's a context. Then there's the other very difficult thing. Now, I want you to consider this, is if professional football players, people who get, someone's paid $40 million for a football player, right, whose achievements are endlessly watched and discussed, how can they be misvalued? And that's the problem you have with it, is it's so easily done. If it can be done at that level, it could be done at work. So you've got interdependence. So it could be someone had an amazing team. It could be that they were working in a company which had a great, at the time it was in a great economy. And then go back to Caroline's points, there's self-fulfilling prophecies. We decide on what something's going to happen. There's all the other biases that go with that. And the interesting one is things like reverse causality. So this was the famous one. I don't know if you ever heard the thing about where people, more charismatic CEOs are viewed as being more successful. That's actually not the case. It's reverse causality there. So in terms of it, it's having to link things back to the organization, and saying, right, we looked at this sample, we did this, and this was the findings that we got. So the organization will trust you more on the decisions that you've made.
Yeah, I think another point to make is in terms of garbage in, garbage out, I think modern HCM platforms have an amazing capability now in terms of helping you collect data that should be more trustworthy. So what I see a lot of organizations doing is falling into the trap of saying, well, it's really easy now to do self-service, so we're going to try and collect a whole bunch of data. My advice to everybody would be, think about what you're trying to achieve with your data, linking it to business outcomes, and minimize how much data you collect to the core data you actually need to answer the question you're trying to answer. And by asking people to maybe collect slightly less data, what I see is that data then becomes more robust, more trustworthy, and then you can move on to maybe other areas. And it's not just always about collecting data that's kind of factual. So I think traditionally HR has been pretty good at answering the factual questions of, what are the costs of employees, what are people being paid, all those sort of questions. I think where HR has been less good is combining that with the sort of voice of the employee, if you like. So that kind of survey, less structured data, and then actually using that data to show the link between an improved performance and sort of changing in behaviors or approaches or processes or whatever it is you're trying to do. So I think there's a whole kind of area here where you need to, again, really just take a step back and think, what data do we actually need to deliver what we want to deliver? And can we focus on that first? And then we can start to add in some of the other stuff that might be available. But don't try and kind of do everything. Keep it quite kind of project, quite focused, and show your wins. And then that by its nature will generate appetite in the business, will drive your ability to get budget and to get visibility, and will elevate your analytics function to that higher level where people can understand, if I've got a business problem, one of the first places I'm going to go to is the HR analytics people team, because actually they can help me with their insight into the data. They can help me solve my business problem. And that's what business leaders want. That per se, they're not that interested in people data. What they're interested in is, how can I deliver what the business needs me to deliver? And if people analytics are going to help me do it, I'm really interested.
Yeah, I think that answers a few of the questions that we got here. So the question of investing in data and the question of HR's credibility. So less is more, and obviously by presenting evidence and speaking the language of the business, you're able to get leadership buy-in and trust that the decisions that you're recommending are not just based on the fact that you feel that's the right thing to do, but based on data and thorough research that truly match with the business needs. We've got a few questions. Before we go into very, very specific ones, I think a lot of people are curious about, diving into the specifics of data, because many organizations don't even know where to start with the data, what to collect and what to do with it. So perhaps we could get Andy or Dom, you can give me some examples of what examples or initiatives or times when you've used data to achieve a specific business outcome, and what it's done for you. So perhaps that could help people understand whether it's in the domain of training or succession planning or recruitment. That would be helpful, I think.
Yeah. So Charlotte, actually, just on the previous point, I think people always have a subservient bias towards external data than internal data. So we do a lot of GPTW, we do a lot of pulse survey across external. People tend to actually really focus and believe on that data. However, the input of that data is from the same employee. So where is the divide? Why do people do not trust internal data vis-a-vis external data? I think it's more to what Dom and Cal both were saying, is that's on the context. And I'll give you a little bit of example of what we are doing with different programs. When we design any program or develop any program, we always talk about where are we in our current state and where do we want to be. And we look at few data points. We look at data points like performance, reviews, which has happened over the last 2 years. We use this because, that actually predicts the future, because past performance would always predict the future performance. So that's one very, very clean data we use. We also use talent review data. We use these two data to actually get people into a program. So we use it as a filtration method in order to identify hypo, identify succession. So that's with past data, what we actually do. What we then do is that any program, we link it to clear business outcomes. So that could be, linked to, outcome like sales, linked to outcome on people performance like 360 or a GPTW survey. And whatever we do in these areas, all of the learning are anchored to enable those areas. So at the end of the program or end of any intervention, we always use that as clear indicators. And some of these indicators can be a multi-rater assessment, where we've stopped using knowledge assessments as indicators of success. We rather use problem solving, case studies, use project-based analysis, and you put all of this in a business relevant data solution. Right. With succession plan, I think what we are now doing is we are actually trying to build a dashboard across the group, which is completely a single view of an employee. of all the all the areas of performance review, learning, as well as we also map how they have moved in their career ladder. So we just to give you a little bit of summary, this is how we really use data in order to identify our next level leaders.
Great, thank you. Dominic, I know you were recently a judge for the CIPD Middle East Awards, where you were looking at digital innovation in HR, which quite links in nicely with that topic. How do we go from where we are now, so again, that business as usual dashboards, whatnot, to more innovative ways of using our data and informing our business and taking our business forward? Or are there some practices that you've either seen within your organization or in the nominations that you've looked at that you thought were truly pushing forward in the right direction?
Yeah, so Charlotte, I saw some fabulous innovations. So what some people had worked really well on doing is putting all that data together. And I think what the really interesting next steps will be is, what do you do with that? So what skills do you need, as we've spoken about, how you take that? So I'll give you some examples of things I use. So when we do our talent process, we have data around the last time we had a performance conversation with someone, the last time they had a pay review, the last time they had a promotion, the last time they had added responsibility. And that gives me information on a potential risk of leaving. So that's a nudge to the line manager to have a conversation there. We've done different things in our sales area on training, taking different types of training and saying, right, if we train in this way or for this length of time, does it make a difference to sales? And we can do this against different subsets of doing things there. Another big thing we've done is we've looked at rewards. So we've changed rewards. So we've got one group being rewarded in a certain kind of way for selling something, and another in another kind of way, and then seeing if there's a difference there. And one thing I do in engagement as well is, when we have an engagement score for a department, I don't just take that as a figure and say, wow, everything's okay. We map that against attrition of high performers and absenteeism as well, which gives us a more of a true figure of what's going on. So it's a case of, I've seen some fabulous things with data going on. I think the interesting thing now will be what people do with that and how they take it back to the business with, it's that, going back to that phrase again, actionable insights, where a CEO can look at something and go, wow, I didn't realize that. That's great. Now I know what we need to do next with our people.
Yes, Caroline?
Yeah, I mean, I think that last point's absolutely key. I think, in order for data and insight to be valuable, I think people need to understand what decision can they make based on that data. What intervention does that data enable them to be confident that they should make? And then on an ongoing basis, how does that help to formulate any future strategy or changes in policy? So that kind of link to, I'm being presented with something and I know what to do with it, and I'm confident that I can trust that data, I think is really important. And I always say to organizations I work with, if you're thinking about what insights you should deliver to the business, you're kind of coming at it from the wrong way, because what you should start from is, what's the business trying to achieve? And then work with the business to say, okay, well, what insights can we provide you that'll help you achieve that outcome? And, if the insights aren't meaningful, they're not accessible, they're not actionable, then they're not good insights. But you need to make sure that they are always in the context of what the business is trying to achieve, because that's going to increase your user adoption. And, we haven't touched on it so much so far in the conversation, but people not only need to trust the data, but they need to want to use it as well. So you have to create that desire as well, alongside the capability to actually want to use the data and want to see the impact of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that you're touching on. We actually got an interesting comment from Fred Pavon, who's here today. And he's saying that, they are saying that their view is that HR analytics mostly always fail, not because of the skills or people factors, but actually because there is no suitable HR analytic product out there for HR. And what they mean by that, which I think is an interesting question around the skills, rather than try to change people to learn HR analytics and develop the right skills, which, like we've all said, will take time and will be a long journey. How about what are there products for HR that speak their language? And then they're asking on that note, what is Oracle's plan regarding delivering an analytics products or service beyond the usual KPIs and dashboards that we've been talking about? So that's one for you, Caroline.
No, I take that one, yeah.
Sorry.
So Fred, I think your comment is valid in the sense of, I think, we at Oracle have probably been slower than we would like to have been in terms of our HR analytics technology. I think we focused very heavily in recent times on delivering what I would call the data platform piece. So I think we've got a really strong proposition now in terms of getting the data in a format and in a single place where you can trust it and you can start to build your analytics. But I do absolutely take your point that the way it's presented doesn't really reflect the way that HR people use language and think of data. What I would say is there is stuff coming down the line which is much more driven by the sorts of questions that HR are going to be asking. So we've got some stuff, obviously subject to safe harbor, we've got some stuff coming which is very much around the sort of diversity and inclusion, and looking at different stages, for example, of the recruiting pipeline and trying to work out where any unconscious bias is coming through. Excuse me. So what I see a lot of companies wanting to do, for example, in recruiting, is to not just look at number of hires or time to hire or where do we get people from. What they want to look at is at all stages in the pipeline, how balanced is that pipeline? And at what point does some of the maybe minority represented groups suddenly kind of drop out? And does that then reflect some kind of level of unconscious bias? And what can we do in that recruiting process to make sure that it's much more skills driven than bias or traditional, historically, I've always got my people from here, so that's where I'm going to go. So I think there's a huge amount that we as technology providers can do to improve visualizations, to deliver content that's much more meaningful in the context of what HR are doing. But that's not to take away the fact that there is a key element in this around the KPIs and the dashboards to be able to monitor your progress and to be able to, again, point to that evidence that the decisions we've made have had the desired impact.
So, Charlotte, I was just reflecting on what Caroline was saying. Caroline, first of all, thanks for being so humble and modest. I think we've used Oracle for the last 4 years. I'll just recall the experiences which we had. We actually co-built the entire learner analytics with Oracle. I think more than a partner, we were actually working together to build it. What we then did is right from the reporting strategy to the N-1 CXO dashboards, we've actually co-partnered with Oracle, and we've actually built it as a separate pass element to it. Now, what outcomes did we get out of it? We were again getting Excel dashboards and all of that. Over the last few years, we've actually looked at getting our own data dashboards from those source dashboards. So we've created our own Power Pivots, we've created our own PowerPoints, and we go back to presenting that. And that again comes back to the context and the culture the company is looking at that data. What we are doing next is we are training most of our L&D guys on Power BI and Tableau so that they get a fully functional data, because we work out of 9 regions, 11 concepts. Each and every business's requirement of data is quite agnostic in nature. I cannot, being at center, give them a central dashboard. So I think it's more about, Fred, it's more about partnering with the system provider or the service provider. And if that partnering is really, really good, you can call out the data you would want. Just wanted to bring that thought across.
I think that's a really interesting point. And for me, I think it's important not to get too hung up on the technology in this conversation. I think if I was looking at, if you're looking at 100% analyst team's time, I'd much rather see the team spending longer with the business, understanding what the priorities are and having the conversations about what the data means. That conversation I talked about earlier, that dialogue around what's the data, take the emotion out of it. If you want data to change behaviors, you need to have conversations. And actually the technology piece of delivering it, for me, shouldn't be the overwhelming part of an analytics team's role. The technology needs to be there, don't get me wrong, but it's about skills, it's about communicating with the business, it's about relationships and working you know, almost becoming like, I have seen some businesses where they've set up a new analytics function and they've almost treated them like a startup within the business and given them that ability to go and sell their service to the business and show their value. And I think that's a really interesting concept as well that some organizations are looking at.
Yeah, Caroline, we set up an entire data labs team for almost 3 years ago, where most of the data is getting validated through an offshore team in India of about 60 people who are just pure data analytics guys. So they do actually, do it for us. We have that luxury. But when we didn't have it, we had to do it all ourselves. But over a period, business realized that how data is equity for us, and even at learning for most of the LMSs and course content, we are at adoption levels of 90%. That cannot happen if business is not given a projection of what data we have now and where do we going to be. Just wanted to get that point through.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really interesting because when we talk about data and analytics and predictive analytics, which we've been talking about for years in HR, we tend to separate it from usual HR topics. You know, it's a different, like we're doing now in a way, it's a different discussion. It's often separated from the rest of the bigger people decisions. But when you look at, in general, if you were to look at customer service or a business in general, data is always under the underlying foundation of any decision that you're going to make, whether you're launching a new product or entering a new region. Or I think it's just it's the perception of data and analytics for HR in particular. It feels like it's been a really hard sell. Dom, I think you've been in the region for longer than I have actually. Have you seen that relationship to data and understanding evolve? Because I remember 8 years ago being in conferences talking about predictive data and AI and AR. We're definitely not there yet, but have you seen an evolution, and what do you think are the opportunities for the region in the future when it comes to data?
No, there's been huge changes. I think the issue is it's the appetite of the leadership and what they want to do with that information, because it's going to take time and investment to go and get it done. So it would depend on your culture. And I think what we're seeing here is in the region, we're super accelerating. I mean, honestly, I would have said when I came over here 15 years ago, we lagged a tiny bit, well, quite a lot from the rest of the world. When I look at some of our practices now, and particularly, very kindly, you helped me judge the awards. Some of the stuff in there is absolutely wow, Charlotte. So we're now moving ahead, and this I think will be part of it. But again, I think it's going to be really silly if we just assume big data is a simple cure for everything. What we've got to be doing, and it goes back again to saying, right, what is it that we're doing? And not having HR departments trying to boil the ocean and saying, right, we're going to build these big giant teams and then nothing comes out of it. Maybe start by doing some small things and going back and saying, right, okay, this is what we could do here. I think once you get credibility in the Gulf, and particularly with different kinds of companies here that are not MNCs, then it's all steam ahead. But people need to see, CEOs need to see an ROI on it. So I've hired these extra people, I'm doing this. What difference is it making to my business? I think when we start to see that, we'll see a greater growth. But in answer to your question, I think we're light years ahead from when I first came over here in 2007.
For sure, for sure. At the same time, we get Ala who's commenting and saying what she sees happen regularly in many places is that companies want data to give them predictions and help them on getting a view of the future. Nevertheless, they do not measure the basic important things. So talking about AI and predictive analytics in many companies is too early. And I think I kind of echo that. So really progression, and it's great to see world-class practices. At the same time, it's too early.
Charlotte, I think one of the key things is when we talk about AI and other things is, would you really allow a robot to pick your team? So we can get data on certain things, but I don't think it's a cure for everything. I think good data will augment good HR, but it won't replace it.
And that brings me back to the question of adoption, which Caroline touched on earlier. In the region, globally, data can be a bit of a hard sell and hard for people to understand and adopt. So often these investments in technology or in getting the right infrastructure are ways. Now, culturally in the Middle East, there is also a tradition of making talent decisions based on more emotive factors, which are often biased, right? So we are very much a region that has tended to rely on relationships where people professionals very often have fallen into HR, and many in the region did not necessarily study HR, went for HR in a career, so don't necessarily have all the skills. And I know this is something that we talked about with you, Dominic, since we're talking about being evidence-based. You were making a few of these observations, as I know you teach CIPD programs for PwC, and you have you've had quite a few hundreds of students in the region. So these are observations that are based on the facts, let's say. Andy, you work in quite a traditional regional business. What do you see the appetite is for data, and do you feel like the culture is ready to adopt a more evidence-based approach when it comes to talent?
So, Charlotte, actually, it's quite an emotional moment for us because we are almost celebrating 48 years in Landmark. We are celebrating 48 years, but we are much ahead in the journey, when it comes to data, when it comes to even taking the smallest decision when it comes to talent with data. Let me give you an overview, right from recruitment to development, to actually even identifying hypos, leave alone placing them, and also looking at engagement. It's all data mined. We exactly know where we are today, and we know that what kind of programmatic interventions or what kind of HR interventions we need to conceive in order to just move the needle. So when it comes to recruitment.
Sorry, I'm mindful of time. Was that always the case, or was there a cultural shift across all these years?
So we started the shift almost four and a half years ago. And the reason was retail was changing, nationalization was coming in, e-commerce was booming in the market. You had most of the e-com giants stepping in. So therefore, there had to be, a change in the game. And therefore, the need was to look at a combination of not only buying talent, but also building talent. And if we had to build talent, we needed data for that talent to substantiate that whether they are our future leaders or not. So yes, critically, the shift has happened almost 5 to 6 years ago. And there has been a complete shift in the entire HR thought process. And I think we've had a seat at the table for the past 6 to 7 years. So I think anything we talk about HR strategy is completely aligned to business strategy, and anything we do is completely dependent on data. So I think we are quite ahead of the curve.
All we want to see is more HR strategy aligned with business strategy. That would be fantastic for the people profession. Dominic, do you have any comments on this before I go to Caroline?
Yeah, just a little bit. I think when we've got the data together, and if you're quite embryonic in your company doing this, then it's down to the skill of the HR manager, director to be able to influence with it. So once you've got it, how do you then use that to sell your story of what you want to do? I think that's one of the things that will help with the change for those that are struggling to do it. You can't walk in and put a PowerPoint up and saying, these are the facts. Well, what does it tell us, and what are we going to do with it afterwards, and how will it benefit us? I think being able to add that narrative as well will be very, very a key skill to bringing the change.
Yeah, I think that's right, isn't it? Because that then gives you the credibility, I think, to have those conversations.
Yeah.
If you add that to the fact that, if you can get to the point where they trust the data, they understand what the outcomes, what the actions are at the end of it. But, I think the comment in the chat about don't run before you can walk is really, really key. We talked at the start about the 4 different sort of categories of analytics, if you like, and it's really important as a business to kind of build up where you are. And Charlotte, to your point, kind of culturally, how people are going to behave and act with that. And it's not something that's going to change overnight. You need to have a plan to evolve over time, I think.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting balance, and what I'm reading in the comments as well is that obviously, like any transformation, this is a long journey to change mindsets and to change cultures and ways of doing and the perception of HR. At the same time, most of the time, people professionals quick win. We'll need to have decisions to be able to make decisions swiftly. We've seen over the past year, we don't always have the time to be done with our full journey. And I think that's where for many it's been difficult, because you don't have the skills yet. You're still getting the buy-in, and yet you need to be able to leverage that data, understand it, and quickly being able to feed it to the business to support the right decisions. Okay, the final question, which I will ask Caroline. If anybody has questions left, we have 5 minutes, so please do drop them in the chat and let us know if this has been helpful. So you've been talking, Caroline, about adoption, and we're talking about, I think, you were highlighting the importance of leadership, walking the talk, and really showing the importance of being evidence-based. A few nuggets there. I think you've really talked about the importance of having less is more, rather than having a ton of data that we can't do anything about. I love the analogy of don't run before you can walk. I think that's the case of all organizations, in particular in the region, because we very often, when we have the budgets, we want to be world leading. And so we just want to adopt everything very fast without having learned to done it. But is there anything else that you would recommend? What recommendations would you give to organizations that are getting started with data, where perhaps you have a group of people, professionals on the team that understand the need, but don't know where to start?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely number one in terms of advice is to align yourself to the business. So, Andy talked about it, your people strategy needs to be aligned to your business strategy, and whatever you want to do with analytics, make sure that you're aligned with the business are going to see the value of it, because that's what's going to drive you getting the investment, the budget, the visibility. Beyond that, for me, there's kind of an acronym that I always have in my mind, which is the word ADD. So the A stands for build up your abilities in this area. So become more data literate as an organization. D is the desire. So engender that desire in the business to want to use the data and to understand what it means, and HR to want to give them that insight. And then finally, the second D is the data strategy and the skills. So you need really strong analytics skills to do this well. And you need those people to have the data that they need to deliver these models, to come up with the insight. So, there's an awful lot there, but everything for me is just driven by aligning yourself to the business and showing real value in terms of outcomes, increasing revenue, whatever it is. You've got to show value to get that investment and priority in terms of budgets.
Yeah, if neither Andy nor Dom have any comments on that, I'll move on to the next question. Yeah. So I guess that's a fitting closing for a webinar held in collaboration with you at Oracle, and we're getting quite a few questions that are related to product. A few people are mentioning that the question of customization. So Ala is saying she thinks it's wrong to assume that all companies are ready and know what they want to measure. It's useful to have a built-in dashboards for companies with the measure elements that everybody asks for, such as human capital, diversity, talent acquisition, management, etc., and then let organizations customize if they want more, rather than them not measuring the right thing. Fred is echoing this point, and please tell me if I'm not understanding this question right. Good point, Ala. The key in your message for me is when you mentioned customization. In my view, this customization process is often prohibitively complex. Hence the reason why I think at the end, this is a product issue. Do you understand the question better than I do? And if so,
Charlotte,
can you answer it?
Charlotte, can I answer this? Because Caroline, apologies, you've done a whole lot of customization because that was the requirement of the business. Now, there are two things with regard to customization at any technology that you would want to look at. Your updates will suffer because it's not your native customization, which is come from the principal product. Therefore, you need to have a resource at hand who would be able to support your updates and upgrades. The biggest challenge with any customization happens is that organizations treat customization as a one-stop solution, whereas it has to be periodic in nature, specifically when the upgrades happen. So here you've customized a solution like an assessment, and then 21B or 21C hits Oracle upgrades, and your assessment is not working because you've used a different customization path. So I think the problem is not customization. The problem is maintaining or AMC with customization the similar way you do with any technology partner. Caroline, if I've commented this carefully on it.
No, I mean, obviously different organizations take different approaches. I mean, our advice would always be as far as possible to just configure rather than customize, and then, configurations come through quite happily on each upgrade. And I think the innovation that is being built into the product on an ongoing basis, is allowing organizations to deliver pretty much most of what they want through configuration routes. So, clearly the more you can configure, the more your data can naturally flow through from your operational transactional data set through to your analytics data set, and you're going to make your life a lot easier. But you're absolutely right, Andy. There's always going to be situations where there's something unique about your business that means that you have to do something a little different, but you've got to accept that there's some cost to your business in terms of delivering that. And it's going to ultimately come down to which side of the balance do you want to go for, I think.
Thank you. To close, I see that we still have questions on the question of culture and buying, and I would like to finish with you, Dominic. What recommendations would you have for people professionals who are seeking to be more evidence-driven and evidence-based, and pushing for change in their organizations, but stumbling across a mindset which is not ready to accept it? Besides changing organizations at worst, what can you do within to push for change, and what would be your argument to get leadership buy-in and push through?
So if I reframe that differently, Charlotte, and it's going on Caroline's point, there wouldn't be an argument about why we need to do it. It's plain and simple. If you can help any line manager make more money, be more productive, be more efficient, you've got automatic buy-in, right? So I don't want to spend days doing presentations. What I could do is go and work with someone and say, listen, let's look at what you do from a people perspective. What problems do you want to solve? And do something. So it's a bit like, we've spoken in the past so many times about how much HR can learn from marketing. Yeah. So marketing would go out and do a little experiment and a survey on something, and then come back and say to the business, look, we've got some evidence from here. We should be doing the same thing. So if you think about it, if you think about our role as maybe being like talent supply chain, okay? So making sure talent's coming to the organization and so on. So we can go back to the business and say, we worked with this area, we did X, Y, and Z, and these were the results, and then let them adopt from there rather than arguing about why we should have it. I think if we can make anybody's life easier, more productive, they can make more money or get more praise from their boss, we get buy-in.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think it's the question of culture comes up often because of ways of doing culturally, notwithstanding, respecting leadership, etc. But ultimately, I know you and many of the fellows of the CIPD that we work with across the region and HR leaders, the way we get that seat at the table and the way we are able to push through talent or people management decisions that without being questioned is because you bring a business case forward. You've already got your data, you've already, and you prove the impact of the business simply. So it's not why do we need analytics and why should we hire that person instead of that person, but it's because you have all that data, you're able to prove not just the impact on the team, but the impact on the bottom line and on your diversity figures and on your productivity and on a whole number of things that surely the business would care about and your CFO would listen.
Correct.
So thank you for that. Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. We're running out of time. Today I was joined by Dominic Peters, who's the Director of People Operations at Axiom Telecom, Caroline Gladwin, who is Executive Director at Oracle. Sorry, I did not say the right job title. Who is the Executive Solution Director for HCM and Analytics at Oracle, and Andy Alindio-Nascar, who is Head of Learning and Development at Denmark Group. I hope this discussion provided some perspective and was a way for you to get answers to your questions. Obviously, if you have any further questions, this session was presented in collaboration with Oracle, and we'll be delighted to hear from you and pass you on. And of course, you can rewatch the session or watch any of our future ones by following us on CIPD Middle East or giving a shout to Caroline, Dominic, or Andy on LinkedIn. I'm sure they will be more than happy to connect. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining me.